The oak-paneled courtroom hummed with quiet tension, its every corner bearing the weight of history. Judge Harrison Grayson sat high on the bench, an imposing figure with silver hair and a stern expression that demanded respect. He was a man of routine and principle, believing himself to be the living embodiment of justice in the small southern town he presided over. His sharp, tailored suit and meticulously organized desk reflected his obsession with order, control, and the perception of authority. In the local legal circles, Grayson was known for his strict sentences. Firm but fair was how his allies described him. But those on the other side of the bench, the defense attorneys representing minorities, had another name for him: the Hammer. Statistics whispered the truth that many dared not speak openly. Harsher sentences for black and brown defendants were a hallmark of his rulings. Whether it was a young man caught with marijuana or a mother fined for missing court-mandated payments, Grayson believed his unyielding approach was a service to the community. They break the law, they pay the price, he would often say to his clerk, Ruth, with a dismissive shrug when questioned about his severity. To him, his courtroom was a bastion of discipline in a world slipping into chaos. Miles away, Tessa Monroe arrived in the town under far less ceremonious circumstances. Driving a modest sedan and dressed casually, she looked like any other passerby. But Tessa was no ordinary visitor. As a federal prosecutor, her assignment was to investigate troubling reports of corruption within the town's legal system. Specifically, allegations of private prisons benefiting from inflated fines and disproportionate sentences. This was more than a case for her. It was personal. Tessa had fought hard for her place in the justice system, often facing both overt and subtle barriers as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated profession. Every step of her career had been a battle to prove her competence and integrity. This town was no different. Even undercover, she could feel the weight of being an outsider. The cold stares, the overly curious shopkeepers, and the patronizing smiles from locals made it clear she didn't belong. After a long day of discreetly gathering information, Tessa stepped out of a diner to find a police officer by her car. "You're parked in a restricted zone," the officer said flatly, tapping his notepad. Tessa frowned, glancing around the street. There were no signs to indicate any restrictions. "I'm sorry, I didn't see any signs," the officer cut her off. "Ignorance of the law isn't an excuse." License and registration. Carefully, Tessa handed over her documents, her mind racing. The last thing she wanted was unnecessary attention, but she also couldn't let this escalate. Minutes later, the officer returned with a new tone. "Step out of the vehicle. There's a warrant tied to this car." Her stomach sank. A warrant? That couldn't be possible. Her papers were clean, and this car was part of her federal cover. Something wasn't adding up, but she knew better than to argue on the street. Complying, she stepped out, suppressing her frustration as cuffs were clipped around her wrists. The next morning, Tessa stood in Judge Grayson's courtroom. She hadn't slept, her wrists were still raw from the cuffs, and the anger simmering in her chest was tightly controlled under a mask of calm professionalism. She reminded herself of her mission. No matter what happened here, she couldn't blow her cover. Judge Grayson barely looked up from his papers as her name was called. "Tessa Monroe," the bailiff announced. Grayson's sharp eyes darted toward her. "Ms. Monroe, you've been cited for parking in a restricted zone. Additionally, records indicate a bench warrant for unpaid fines in this jurisdiction." Tessa cleared her throat. "Your Honor, with respect, there must be a mistake. This is my first time in this town. I've never had any fines here." Grayson's expression tightened, and he leaned forward, studying her as though gauging the truth. His tone remained cold and detached. "The warrant is clear, Ms. Monroe. Ignorance of its existence doesn't absolve you of responsibility. I'm imposing a fine of $500, payable within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in further penalties." Tessa blinked. $500 for a parking violation and an unsubstantiated warrant? It was excessive, to say the least, but she bit her tongue. Any protest might draw more attention than she could afford. $500? She asked, her voice level but firm. Grayson's gavel came down with an authoritative crack. "This is not a negotiation, Ms. Monroe. "You're dismissed." The humiliation stung as she stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Grayson one last time before leaving the courtroom, her composure intact, but her mind already racing. The fine wasn't just unfair. It was a deliberate act of bias and a small reflection of the corruption she was here to expose. As she exited the courthouse, she resolved to remain patient. This was only the beginning, and if Judge Grayson thought he'd seen the last of her, he was sorely mistaken. Tessa spent the next few days moving through the quiet streets of the town with a sense of purpose that belied her unassuming appearance. She kept her cover intact, blending into the background, as she began piecing together a pattern she already suspected. The case file she had reviewed before arriving painted a grim picture of the local justice system, but seeing the effects in person made it all too real. Her first step was to dig into Judge Grayson's sentencing records. Using a combination of discreet inquiries and her legal expertise, she gained access to court dockets, public records, and personal testimonies. The numbers were damning. A disproportionately high number of Black and Latino defendants had been handed the harshest penalties, often for minor infractions. Meanwhile, their white counterparts, charged with similar or even more severe offenses, received leniency, a suspended sentence, community service, or a modest fine. Tessa's frustration grew as she spoke with locals who had been through Grayson's courtroom. At the community center on the edge of town, she met a young man named Jamal, whose life had been derailed after a single marijuana possession charge. "I was 19, Jamal explained, his voice heavy with bitterness. "First offense. But Grayson threw the book at me. 6 months in jail, a $1,000 fine, and probation. My public defender told me to take the deal because it could have been worse." He glanced at Tessa, his dark eyes filled with distrust. "You don't look like you're from around here. Why are you asking about him anyway?" Tessa hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully to avoid revealing her mission. "Let's just say I'm interested in how things work here. Do you think the judge treated you fairly?" Jamal gave a hollow laugh. "Fairly? Lady, if you're not rich or white in his courtroom, you don't stand a chance." His story was echoed by others. A single mother who had been jailed for unpaid parking tickets. An elderly Black man who had lost his home after being fined into bankruptcy for zoning violations. Each account added another layer to the web of bias and exploitation Tessa was determined to untangle. While Tessa's investigation deepened, Judge Grayson remained steadfast in his belief that he was a paragon of justice. Over dinner with his longtime friend and fellow judge, Thomas Carlyle, Grayson dismissed the growing criticisms as unfounded. "People love to cry racism when things don't go their way," Grayson said, sipping his bourbon. "They break the law, and they think they deserve a free pass because of the color of their skin. It's absurd." Carlyle frowned, but didn't argue, knowing Grayson's stubborn streak well. "You know, Harry, the numbers do raise some eyebrows. Maybe it's worth looking into, just to be sure you're not being unfairly targeted." Grayson waved him off. "I don't need a lecture, Tom. I know what I'm doing. If people can't handle consequences, that's their problem, not mine." Despite his outward confidence, the conversation lingered in Grayson's mind. He prided himself on his ability to be impartial, yet the criticisms gnawed at his carefully constructed self-image. But rather than reflect deeply, he doubled down on his convictions, viewing any challenge to his authority as an attack on the law itself. Tessa's undercover work began to attract attention. Her constant questions and quiet presence didn't go unnoticed, especially by those invested in maintaining the status quo. Rumors about the nosy outsider reached Grayson through informal channels, but he didn't think much of it until her name came up in an unexpected context. It started with a routine clerical review in the courthouse. A clerk inadvertently stumbled upon Tessa's full credentials, including her position as a federal prosecutor. The information made its way to Grayson's desk within hours. When he saw her name, his initial reaction was disbelief. "She's a prosecutor?" he asked Ruth, his clerk, who had brought him the file. "Yes, sir. Federal." Ruth's voice was tinged with unease. "She's not just passing through. She's been digging into records." "Your records?" Grayson's stomach churned. A federal prosecutor investigating his courtroom? The implications were staggering. If her intentions were hostile, she could cause real damage, not just to him, but to the entire judicial system he upheld. But why would a federal prosecutor go undercover in his town? What was she after? For the first time in years, Grayson felt a flicker of doubt, not about himself, but about the stability of the carefully maintained world he had built. He resolved to confront Tessa the next time she appeared in his courtroom, determined to assert his authority and uncover her motives. Unbeknownst to him, Tessa already anticipated this turn of events. The discovery of her true identity didn't derail her mission. It sharpened her focus. She knew Grayson would see her as a threat, and she intended to use that fear to her advantage. Her plan wasn't just to expose him, but to dismantle the corrupt system he represented, piece by piece. As Grayson wrestled with his growing paranoia, Tessa continued her work, methodically collecting the evidence she needed. Each new discovery brought her closer to the truth, and closer to a confrontation that neither of them could avoid. The deeper Tessa delved into the town's legal system, the more unsettling her findings became. What had initially appeared to be a case of individual bias soon revealed itself as part of a meticulously engineered operation. The financial underpinnings of Judge Grayson's courtroom pointed to something far more sinister: a thriving arrangement between the justice system and the privately owned Thornton Correctional Facility. Her analysis of public records showed a glaring discrepancy. Grayson's courtroom disproportionately funneled offenders into Thornton, often for trivial offenses. Parking violations, possession of small amounts of marijuana, and petty thefts, infractions that might elsewhere warrant warnings or fines, were routinely escalated to incarcerations. Thornton, bound by a lucrative state contract, received substantial funding for every occupied cell. At first, Tessa dismissed the possibility of Grayson's direct involvement. But as she sifted through financial disclosures, she noticed irregularities in town budgets. Community investment funds from Thornton's parent company were discreetly funneled into municipal accounts. While Grayson's name didn't appear explicitly, the timing and amounts of these payments lined up disturbingly well with sentencing spikes from his courtroom. The implications sent a chill down Tessa's spine. Grayson wasn't just biased. He was complicit in a system that traded justice for profit. As Tessa pieced together this web of corruption, her work brought her closer to danger. Her growing presence in town was impossible to ignore. One night, she parked her car outside her apartment only to find a man leaning casually against her hood. "Evening," he said, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He flicked a cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his heel. "You're the nosy type, aren't you?" Tessa's instincts kicked in. "Excuse me, but I don't believe we've met." Her voice was calm, betraying none of the alarm coursing through her. The man chuckled. "Word travels fast around here. Folks don't take kindly to strangers poking their heads where they don't belong." He stepped closer, his tone dropping to a low threat. "Might be best for everyone if you took your questions and left town." Tessa didn't flinch. She met his gaze, silently daring him to act. After a tense moment, the man stepped back, shaking his head. "Suit yourself," he muttered before walking away. Tessa exhaled slowly. She wasn't scared easily, but the encounter left her shaken. She realized that her investigation wasn't just about uncovering truth. It was about survival. As Tessa's resolve hardened, Judge Grayson found himself increasingly unsettled. For years, he had operated under the belief that his rulings were just, that his strict approach upheld the moral fabric of the community. But Tessa's presence gnawed at him. One sleepless night, he sat in his dimly lit study, nursing a glass of bourbon. Memories of his career flooded back, unbidden. He remembered a particular case from early in his tenure. A black mother of 3, charged with shoplifting baby formula. He had delivered a scathing reprimand before sentencing her to jail. At the time, he had felt righteous, certain he was teaching her a lesson. Now, as he stared into the amber liquid swirling in his glass, doubt crept in. What had that ruling accomplished? Had he really upheld justice? Or had he just perpetuated a cycle of poverty and despair? Other cases followed in his mind, each one casting his decisions in a harsher light. The young man jailed for loitering outside a grocery store. The teenage girl fined into debt for skipping school. He had always dismissed criticism as the whining of those unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. But what if they were right? The more he thought about it, the more the cracks in his moral certainty began to show. Meanwhile, Tessa pushed forward, undeterred by the mounting risks. Her most significant breakthrough came when she uncovered a series of confidential emails between Thornton Correctional Facility's executives and local officials. The language was vague but telling. Phrases like ensuring capacity utilization and coordinated efforts to maintain compliance all but confirmed her suspicions. The town's legal system was operating as a feeder for Thornton's bottom line. One name kept appearing in the correspondence: Peter Langston, a wealthy developer with deep ties to the prison and the town council. Tessa arranged a meeting under the guise of a journalist covering local business initiatives. Langston was the picture of corporate charm, impeccably dressed, his handshake firm but practiced. They met in his gleaming office, where every surface gleamed with understated wealth. As they spoke, Tessa steered the conversation toward the prison. Langston's smooth exterior barely faltered, but his eyes narrowed slightly at her line of questioning. "Thornton has been a boon to this town," he said. "Jobs, investments, security. You can't put a price on that kind of contribution." Tessa pressed further, her voice steady. "But doesn't the town's dependency on inmate quotas create perverse incentives? It's not about justice anymore. It's about profit." Langston's smile tightened. "I think you're reading too much into it," he said coolly, but his tone carried an edge of warning. The meeting ended cordially, but Tessa left with no illusions. Langston was deeply involved, and he wasn't going to let her expose the operation without a fight. For Grayson, the turning point came during a routine sentencing. A young black man stood before him, accused of stealing a bicycle. The prosecutor urged a harsh penalty, citing prior offenses. Normally, Grayson would have delivered the maximum sentence without hesitation. But as he looked at the defendant, he saw something different. He saw a scared young man who had made a mistake. Not a criminal, but a person. For the first time in years, Grayson hesitated. The gavel felt heavy in his hand. "Probation and community service," he said finally, ignoring the surprised murmurs from the courtroom. As the young man was led away, Grayson felt an unfamiliar weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't absolution, but it was a start. Tessa's work was far from over. She knew that exposing the corruption would require more than evidence. It would require courage, strategy, and a willingness to risk everything. But she also knew this. The system she was fighting wasn't invincible, and neither was Judge Harrison Grayson. Their confrontation wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about forcing a reckoning for the town, for the justice system, and for themselves. It was an unseasonably warm evening when the annual Town Hall fundraiser gala brought together the town's elite under the soft glow of chandeliers in the century-old municipal building. Tessa, dressed in a sleek black dress, moved through the crowd with purpose, her polished exterior masking the storm brewing beneath. The invitation had come through her cover, a chance to rub shoulders with the very people she was investigating. Judge Harrison Grayson was there, of course, standing near the buffet table with a glass of bourbon in hand. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes darted across the room, betraying his unease. He hadn't spoken to Tessa directly since discovering her true identity, but her presence loomed in his mind like a shadow he couldn't escape. Tessa spotted him, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just a gala, it was a battlefield. She crossed the room, her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor, and stopped just a few feet away. "Judge Grayson," she said, her tone polite but firm. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded neutrality. "Ms. Monroe, enjoying the evening?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes piercing. "As much as one can at these things," he replied, taking a deliberate sip of his drink. "What brings you here?" Tessa smiled faintly. "Oh, just mingling, observing. It's interesting to see how the town's movers and shakers operate when they're not in court." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Careful, Ms. Monroe. You wouldn't want to start throwing accusations without proof." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to add weight to her words. "Who said anything about accusations, Judge? But since we're on the topic, tell me, how does it feel to know that your rulings have done more to break this community than to uphold it?" Grayson's composure faltered for a split second, his face hardening. I enforce the law. It's not my fault if people can't follow it. And who decides what justice looks like? Tessa countered. You sit on that bench and claim to uphold fairness, but the data says otherwise. Your courtroom feeds a system designed to exploit the vulnerable and reward the powerful. Are you really blind to it? Or are you just complicit? Her words hit like a punch, and for a moment, Grayson said nothing. The room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of conversations fading into the background. I don't need a lecture on morality from someone who doesn't understand what it's like to hold this kind of responsibility, he said finally, his voice tight. Tessa's eyes narrowed. And what responsibility is that? To ensure that Thornton Correctional stays profitable? To make sure the town's coffers are full, no matter the cost to the people you claim to serve? Grayson stiffened. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, but I do, she said, her voice rising slightly. I've seen the records, the sentencing patterns, the so-called community investments. This isn't justice, Judge Grayson. It's corruption, and you've built your career on it. Grayson didn't sleep that night. Tessa's words echoed in his mind, each one peeling back another layer of his carefully constructed sense of righteousness. He sat alone in his study, staring at the stacks of case files he had brought home. For the first time, he looked at them not as a judge, but as a man questioning his place in the world. The faces of defendants stared back at him from photographs clipped to the files. Young, scared, and overwhelmingly black or Latino. He thought about Tessa's accusations, the evidence she had hinted at, and the stories he had heard over the years but dismissed. Had he been enforcing the law or perpetuating a system of oppression? His mind went to a single case that haunted him now more than ever. A teenage boy who had been caught stealing a pair of sneakers. The boy had pleaded with him, explaining that he needed them for gym class, that his family couldn't afford a new pair. Grayson had sentenced him to 6 months in Thornton Correctional. At the time, he had justified it as a lesson in accountability. Now he wasn't so sure. The doubt was like a splinter lodged deep in his psyche, impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Tessa's investigation had reached a critical juncture. A leak in the town council had handed her a bombshell, a confidential memo outlining the financial arrangements between Thornton Correctional and the local government. The document detailed inmate quotas, profit-sharing agreements, and even suggestions for how to subtly influence court decisions to ensure compliance. The memo was all the proof she needed to expose the corruption, but it also came with risks. Once the information went public, she would be a target, not just for Langston and his allies, but for anyone in town who had benefited from the arrangement. The next morning, the local news ran a story about Tessa's investigation. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor Probes Corruption in Town Justice System." Within hours, the courthouse was swarming with reporters, and the public's attention had turned squarely on Grayson. Grayson felt the walls closing in. As he walked into the courthouse that morning, he was met with a barrage of questions from journalists. Judge Grayson, do you have any comment on the allegations of corruption? Did you knowingly collaborate with Thornton Correctional? Are you stepping down from your position? He pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding. Once inside, he shut his office door and leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. The day's docket sat untouched on his desk. He couldn't bring himself to open it. Instead, he stared out the window, his mind racing. What if Tessa was right? What if his rulings had done more harm than good? And what if the public outrage wasn't just about corruption, but about him, about the choices he had made and the lives he had impacted? As he stood there, a realization hit him with the force of a gavel striking the bench. Justice wasn't about the law alone. It was about the people it served, and he had failed them. The confrontation with Tessa had been the spark, but the fire was now raging out of control. Grayson knew that his next move would define not only his career, but his legacy. For the first time in decades, he wasn't sure what to do. All he knew was this: the system he had upheld was crumbling, and he was standing in the rubble. The day had arrived. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled with townspeople, reporters, and officials. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that comes when a town is about to witness its darkest secrets dragged into the light. Tessa Monroe stood at the front, her presence commanding but composed. Her months of painstaking investigation had led to this moment, and she was ready. Judge Grayson sat in his usual place on the bench, but he was not presiding today. A state-appointed magistrate had taken his seat, a visible symbol of the seismic shift in power. Grayson looked older than he had in years, his usual stern mask replaced by something more human, apprehension. The magistrate called the hearing to order, and Tessa began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "what we are about to discuss is not just a legal matter, but a moral reckoning. The evidence I present today will show a pattern of corruption that has poisoned this town's justice system, turning it into a tool of exploitation rather than fairness." She started with the data, presenting charts and statistics that revealed glaring disparities in sentencing. 80% of Judge Grayson's harshest rulings were against people of color, many for minor infractions. Meanwhile, wealthier defendants with similar or more severe offenses consistently received leniency. Gasps rippled through the room as Tessa displayed case files. She pointed to specific examples: a black teenager sentenced to 6 months for loitering, while a white business owner caught embezzling funds received probation. But the most damning evidence came next. Tessa held up the leaked memo. "This document," she said, her voice rising, "is a smoking gun. It outlines a profit-sharing arrangement between Thornton Correctional Facility and local officials. It details inmate quotas that Judge Grayson's courtroom has been instrumental in meeting. This is not justice. This is human lives being commodified for profit." The room erupted in murmurs, disbelief and outrage mingling in the crowd. All eyes turned to Grayson. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The magistrate addressed him directly. "Judge Grayson, you have heard the allegations against you. You now have an opportunity to respond." Grayson rose slowly, his legs feeling like lead. The room fell silent, every person waiting for his next words. He hesitated, his voice faltering. "I believed that I was enforcing the law, that I was protecting this town." He paused, looking out over the crowd. He saw familiar faces, defendants he had sentenced, families he had ignored. The weight of their collective gaze bore down on him. "I see now that I failed you," he said, his voice breaking. "I see that my rulings weren't just harsh. They were unjust. I trusted a system that I should have questioned, and for that, I am deeply sorry." The room was silent, the gravity of his words hanging in the air. As Grayson sat down, the magistrate turned to Tessa. "Ms. Monroe, do you wish to continue?" "Yes, Your Honor," Tessa replied. She stepped forward, addressing the crowd as much as the court. "This is not just about one man," she said. "This is about a system that allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. Judge Grayson's actions were wrong, but so were the choices of every official, every business owner, and every voter who looked the other way. Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us." Her words struck a chord. People in the audience shifted uncomfortably, the truth cutting through their defenses. The aftermath was swift and chaotic. News outlets ran stories about the hearing, painting Grayson as both a villain and a cautionary tale. Thornton Correctional's contract was terminated, and a state-led investigation into the facility's practices began. For Grayson, the fallout was personal and profound. He tendered his resignation the next day, stepping down from the bench he had occupied for decades. In a heartfelt statement to the press, he admitted his complicity and pledged to spend the rest of his life working to undo the harm he had caused. The town's reaction was mixed. Some lauded his honesty, seeing his admission as a step toward healing. Others viewed it as too little too late. For many, the scars of his rulings would never fade. Tessa, meanwhile, became a local hero. Her bravery and persistence had forced the town to confront its darkest truths. But for her, the victory was bittersweet. She knew that dismantling systemic injustice was a marathon, not a sprint. One evening, as she packed up her temporary office, a young man approached her. It was the teenager Grayson had sentenced for loitering years ago. "Ms. Monroe," he said shyly, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it means a lot." Tessa smiled, her resolve renewed. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just promise me one thing. Anything, he said. Pay it forward. Make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight this fight. The boy nodded, and as he walked away, Tessa felt a glimmer of hope. The town was quieter now, its air heavy with change. The courthouse, once a place of dread for many, was now the center of a new conversation. A conversation about justice, about fairness, about accountability. The shockwaves from the exposure of the corruption in the local legal system had not faded. In fact, they were still rippling through every corner of the community. Tessa Monroe sat in a small cafe downtown, sipping her coffee as she gazed out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the streets. The protests had died down, the media frenzy had subsided, but the work was far from over. She had won a significant battle, but the war for true justice in the town was just beginning. She thought about the people she had met along the way, the faces of the wronged, the broken lives that had been stitched together by her pursuit of truth. It had been a long and often painful journey, but Tessa felt a sense of pride that surpassed any momentary victory. She had forced the town to see its own reflection, a reflection they had long tried to ignore. The changes were tangible now, small but crucial steps forward. A new board was in place to review sentencing patterns, and the investigation into private prison kickbacks had prompted a statewide reevaluation of such practices. Tessa knew that reform would take time, but for the first time, the people had a voice. They had a chance. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her supervisor. The feds are launching a broader probe. You've made waves, Tessa. Keep pushing. She smiled softly. There was still so much work to be done, but she wasn't doing it alone anymore. She wasn't just fighting an anonymous system. Now, the town's eyes were open, and they could no longer look away. A few weeks later, Grayson made his first public appearance since his resignation. He stood at a podium outside the courthouse, his face drawn, but there was no arrogance in his demeanor. The man who had once commanded authority, with every word now spoke with humility. People of this town, he began, his voice steady but somber. I stand before you as someone who failed you. I failed to see the deeper flaws in our justice system, flaws that I contributed to for far too long. I allowed my biases to shape my rulings, and in doing so, I harmed many innocent lives. I cannot undo the damage I've caused, but I can try to make things right. The crowd was silent, many of them skeptical, some of them angry. They had suffered under his rulings, and now they had to decide if they could ever forgive him. He took a deep breath before continuing. I've decided to dedicate my time to helping reform this broken system. I will work with the town's new Justice Reform Coalition to ensure that the pain of the past does not repeat itself. I'll advocate for changes to the way we sentence, the way we treat those who have been marginalized. And I'll do everything I can to be part of the healing process. There was no applause, no immediate sign of reconciliation, but Grayson didn't expect any. He had come to terms with the fact that redemption would be a long road. But the first step, at least, had been taken. Months passed, and though the road was still fraught with challenges, the town began to feel different. The Justice Reform Coalition, which Tessa had helped establish, began hosting community forums. They weren't large gatherings. Most meetings were attended by local activists, concerned citizens, and the occasional town official. But they were a place for open dialogue, a place where people could express their frustrations and hopes for the future. And with each passing session, more and more townspeople began to show up. One day, Tessa attended one of these forums. She sat in the back, listening intently as a young man, one of the beneficiaries of the new reform policies, shared his story. I was the kid who always got in trouble with the law, he said. But when I got arrested last year, I didn't end up in Thornton Correctional. Instead, I was given community service, a mentor, and a chance to turn my life around. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I have a chance now. And that means everything. The room nodded in agreement. Tessa felt a small but powerful surge of hope. The system that had once crushed so many was slowly being rebuilt from the inside out. She had played a part in that transformation, but it wasn't just her effort. It was the work of the people, the community that had finally started to speak up and demand change. Later that evening, Tessa found herself standing at the edge of the courthouse steps, looking out over the square. She watched as a group of teenagers crossed the street, laughing and talking among themselves. For once, she didn't see them as potential defendants, as people who would one day stand before a judge who might sentence them based on their race, class, or appearance. No, tonight they were just kids, living, laughing, breathing without fear. She turned as she heard footsteps behind her. It was Grayson, walking slowly toward her. She didn't speak right away, allowing the silence to hang between them. Finally, he stopped a few feet away and said, "I wanted to thank you, Tessa. I know I didn't have a chance to say it properly before. You didn't just expose the flaws in the system. You gave people a chance at something better." Tessa didn't smile, but her expression softened. "We all have a role to play. You're doing yours now." Grayson nodded, his face lined with regret, but also resolve. "I have a long way to go, but I'll keep trying." They stood there together for a long moment, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small, quiet victory, but it was theirs. The town had changed, and with it, the people who lived in it. The story of Tessa Monroe and Judge Harrison Grayson would become a legend in the town. A story of struggle, of painful truths, and ultimately of redemption. Though the fight for justice wasn't over, the seeds of change had been planted. A fair trial for a minority defendant, a moment of fairness and compassion in the courtroom, was no longer a rare occurrence. It was becoming the norm, and that, Tessa thought, was the beginning of something powerful.